Welcome everyone. Welcome to our second episode of the webinar around engaging the paddle sport community, sharing experiences and expertise around all things coaching and paddle sport related. As I say, I'd like us, if you're not on the panel today, of which there are three panelists and myself, if you could politely mute your mics and turn your cameras off just to keep the bandwidth on the call as low as possible. That'd be much appreciated. We are recording today, so please bear that in mind when you interact. The way to interact is through the chat forum on here. I'll be across any questions, comments, and feel free to interact with each other on that forum as well. And we will try and do our best to get through the questions as we go. A special mention for two of our canoeing family before we start. Gaz Wilson, many of you know, has been quite instrumental in helping set up this initiative and getting it off the ground, and his wife Kat, big part of our canoeing family across many disciplines. I had a baby boy a few days ago, Frederick, to add to their family of young daughter Lexi, so I'm sure you join me in wishing them many congratulations. And he would have been on this call as coach to Chris. I suspect he's now baby in hand, earphones in the ears, slightly nervous about the shortcomings and strengths he might reveal, Chris, in your relationship with him. I'm sure we're not going to get too many juicy details, but I'm sure he's slightly nervous. It's a good place to be. Brilliant. So this week's topic, everyone, coach-athlete relationships, and delighted to have a panel with us today, and I'm really appreciative of them giving up their time. I'm going to just fly around them for a quick and brief introduction. Tim Scott, if you could kick us off.
Hi, Craig. Thanks for inviting me. I'm a coach at Norwich Canoe Club. I'm one of the coaches. I'm self-employed, but up until a couple of weeks ago, the club employed me for enough hours that I was full-time. So I have a lot of different roles at Norwich Canoe Club, but predominantly I spend my time, most of my time, as a junior development coach.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tim. Great to have you. Chris, a little intro from you.
Chris Bowers, I guess, been on the senior team for the past 3 years running, been involved in the British canoeing program for the past 7 years, I think now, and involved in canoeing for the past 10 years.
Brilliant. Thank you. And last but not least, Danielle, a little intro from you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming and thanks for having me. I am currently working as the sports psychologist in the Canoe Slalom program, so covering a fair few of the senior athletes and almost all of the athletes down the program in the podium potential piece of the Lee Valley setup. I have been working as a sports psychologist for, I probably should have known how many years coming into this, about 7 or 8, I think, across a number of different sports. Was an athlete myself in a whole nother lifetime ago. And spent a lot of time studying in the meantime. But I've been at the Canoe Slalom program for about 3.5 years now. That's me really.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Let's dive straight in. So coach-athlete relationships, for me, a topic that's receiving more and more airtime. The more and more I am around coaching, certainly in the last sort of 5 years, there's been a lot in the research field around this. I'm delighted to have Danielle to kick us off. I'm really pleased, Danielle, you mentioned your athlete career. I'm aware you trained in an international training camp as well, a training base out in the States. And then have practiced as a psychologist in England across many sports. Are you happy to share what sports you've covered, Danielle, in your psychology role to date?
Yeah, no problem. So I started the sports psychology work at the Scottish Institute of Sport. Really, that was the first role I played, and that was a multi-sport setup with very limited time given to each and every sport that I worked across. Some of that work was individual athlete focus, rugby players, gymnasts, judokas, triathletes, swimmers, everything but canoe slalom, I reckon. And and sometimes it was one-to-one sport delivery to the athletes themselves. But at times what we found is that where I was given maybe sort of 10 days a year to work under a specific program, we chose to use that psychology to work directly with the coaches, because we saw that that'd be a more efficient way to bring psychology to the athletes through the coaches. And since then have moved into working directly with sports more so than across different sports, and have spent time with swimming, para swimming, netball, fencing, to here.
Brilliant. Thanks, Danielle. A really good insight. She's worked, we're fortunate to have her on. She's worked across individuals, team sports, across the pathway right through to Olympic level, and being an athlete herself. So let's dive straight in, Danielle. With all that in mind, I guess what do coach-athlete relationships mean to you?
So from predominantly a psychological perspective, there's a huge crossover from psychology and coach-athlete relationships, given that we're talking about the understanding of people and behaviour. When you're looking at an athlete-coach relationship, you're looking at the crossover of those two things. So almost two people with two different thoughts, feelings and behaviours going on, interacting with one another. Probably done a lot of thought and reflection onto the coach-athlete relationship through my time at Canoe Slalom, more so than ever. Mostly because we get the fortunate opportunity to really focus on the development of intimate coach-athlete relationships, particularly in the senior program. And so that's kind of afforded me the time to really think about what does that mean for me in my role at this moment in time. Going into this seminar or webinar, I think Craig and I did acknowledge that is something that we are very fortunate to be able to do at this part of the program. So I'll speak predominantly from that perspective today, and also recognize that you might not have that luxury, but hoping that what we speak about today, predominantly from that perspective, you can then challenge yourself to go away and think about what does that mean for you, and how does that apply for you in your coaching roles, no matter where you are. Long spiel, ultimately, what I truly think is that if you're working with an athlete, what you really want to get them to the point of is confidence in what they're doing and why they're doing it, whether that be a training session or a competition, and however important that competition is. They want to have confidence in what they're doing and why they're doing it, and the clarity to be able to work with what they're doing when they're doing it. That has huge positive effects, given that the way the human brain works, there are a number of challenges in the way the human brain works. So lots of threats coming in at any point in time, from a very young athlete to even a senior athlete. If they're trying to achieve something specifically, there's going to be some emotional threats all the way through that journey. And I see the coach-athlete relationship as the critical piece to helping the athlete have confidence and clarity in what they're doing for when those threats do come into play. I don't know if that answer your first question.
Absolutely. No, I've written down some key points there, like the role of the relationship is really to provide confidence and clarity.
Yeah.
That's coming across really strong at any stage, given that we will have, I guess, challenge to that through a natural process in a relationship, as we would in any relationship. Yeah, it's coming across strong.
So I guess the only additional piece to that, before I sort of touch a little bit on the research, if that makes sense, would be to look at the athlete as the individual that doesn't have the knowledge of where they could get to just yet. They've got a true understanding of, or not maybe an understanding, that all they've got is their own lens and where they maybe want to get to. Whereas the coach being the ability to provide a different perspective, a different lens, from an expert opinion, really. And therefore you can use the coach-athlete relationship as a coach to truly facilitate the growth of the athlete along the way, by making decisions around what information to share, when to share it, what questions to ask, how to ask them. So there is obviously lots of research going on in this area. I've got a couple of slides that I could share with you if I just take a minute to do that. Rich, you've seen these before a couple of years ago. I wonder if you remember them.
Well, you're teeing that up, Danielle. I'd just like to dive in a little bit on something you said about a different lens there. So the coach providing or being able to provide a different lens. It always strikes me that in any relationship there is a self and a other. I guess what do you see in terms of the development of self as a coach? How well you need to understand yourself in order to understand what lens you are putting across or what lens you are seeing the situation from?
Yeah, definitely see that. I'm not sure there's much more to add to what you just said, actually. Just that the whole point of self-awareness and ability to self-regulate as a coach, knowing what your philosophy is, what you believe in, and how you want to go about instilling the knowledge that you have to support the growth of the athletes that you're working with, really comes down to how, like, you knowing yourself, where your knowledge came from, how you want to apply that knowledge, how the application of that knowledge might change based on how you're feeling that day even. And so important for you to also have confidence and clarity in what you're doing while you're doing it, as often as possible. What you say and how you say it can be the difference in what an athlete takes away and how they go about attacking the next training session or the next skill they want to evolve. So I think, self-reflection as a coach to have clarity on who you are and why you're doing it is really important to be able to then have an impact on the coach-athlete relationship in a positive way for, as I said, the ultimate growth of the athlete.
Fantastic. Thank you.
We've used a fair amount of the research from Dr. Jauer in this area on coach-athlete relationships. So I've just pulled a little bit of information from her research on the basis that there's a generic application and understanding of coach-athlete relationships out there in the research before delving into the intricacies of how to apply that within canoe slalom specifically. So I thought I'd just touch a little bit on that. I think probably the value in the webinar is going into a little bit more detail around what you guys are working with and some questions. But this seemed to be a great place to start in getting a foundation. This is merely a definition that's come out of the research. Lots of C's. I've already talked about confidence and clarity, and that's our own interpretation of that in canoe slalom. But this is the research definition that I've referred to in the past. So a social situation, athletes coach and feeling of closeness, thoughts of commitment, and behaviours that are complementary, mutually and casually interdependent. And I like that notion of interdependence personally. We're not looking at reliance or even codependence. There's individual and coach are able to work themselves and use each other appropriately as they go through that journey. And these are more measures, really, the closeness, commitment, and complementarity of one another. And Sophia Jauer, in her research, has almost put them together, three areas that ultimately relate to this co-orientation or codependence. Closeness, referring to a bond, the affective bond, the emotional bond that develops through feelings, so trust, appreciation, liking of one another. Then the complementarity piece, referring to an athlete's behaviours and cooperation and collaboration, how well they work together. Commitment, I mean, it says it there on the slide, I'm reading it out to you. The athlete and coach's thoughts to maintain a close relationship over time, no matter what they're going through. I think you'll all recognise as coaches and have been there through the ups and downs of working with different athletes. Chris, yourself as an athlete would have experienced those ups and downs yourself. So this piece around commitment is really important in that, because there will be emotional blowouts. There will be times of failure, of needing to reset, but this recognizes that closeness and complementarity, as well as the co-orientation that ultimately comes from the combination of the three, can be consistent or constant throughout, despite the challenges that the relationship might have through the pursuit to perform ultimately. So I've already said the closeness, commitment and complementarity in Joette's research. She's put them together to then ultimately come to this idea of co-orientation, agreement, similarity within the athlete and coach's perceptions, ultimately about the quality of the relationship in itself. So that the output of what I would say as clarity and confidence can be as good as possible and as optimized as possible. What Joette's research also does is provide this tandem cycle. It's quite a nice tool, I think, on a very generic basis for coaches to refer to the process of ask, check and reflect. Particularly in terms of working on the fruitfulness of the coach-athlete relationship that you have with your individual athletes. And it's really encouraging you to reflect on predominantly what is going on within that relationship, how well you know it, what do you know about it, and then the checking piece on the closeness, commitment, complementarity and co-orientation, as well as that reflection piece. So how can you assist the athlete to develop further? What can you do as a coach to enhance that growth? What's being contributed to that partnership from yourself as a coach to the athlete, whether that be through emotional connection or knowledge and experience. I think that's for me some really useful pieces from the research, and if any of you were interested in reading more about that, can send on the references for you to develop a little bit more understanding. I think, Craig, you've gone through a little bit more of Joette's research on a deeper level, if you wanted to share any more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been fortunate enough to cross paths with Sophia on one of my coaching courses. Yeah, she provides a lot of good stuff and is probably the driving force in this area of the research side, and is increasingly trying to apply it into context, which we'll delve into very soon. Reese, yes, we can add content here to the show notes at the end so this show has been recorded. It will be available on the digital library, and we'll provide the links to that from Danielle and anything else that are useful and can be linked through the Facebook page. Danielle, I really, really enjoyed that last sort of sense of ask. I think that's so important when we consider checking through our lens, that sense of understanding before attempting to be understood. I think that's a really powerful starting point for any relationship interaction. I guess what people are probably asking now, it looks lovely on paper, and in a model beautifully put up on some slides there. I guess in your experience within canoe slalom, I guess from a coaching angle particularly, what have you observed in terms of behaviors that are both conducive and maybe some that challenge the building and maintenance of a coach-athlete relationship?
Some things I think that are worth reflecting on. And I'd invite Chris perhaps to chip in on this if he sees the moment to, are that I think sometimes it's really easy for coaches and athletes to aspire to a natural, organic relationship that's just fallen into place because everything clicks. And I think I'm really keen to move away from that idea, or to help coaches and athletes move away from that idea, and more to a place where probably any coach could work with any athlete, and any athlete could get to the space where they're working with any coach in the way they want to. And in terms of supporting that relationship from a psychological perspective, what I try to do in slalom is bring topics and issues that are related to an athlete's development and performance to the surface. And I talk quite a lot about giving permission, athletes identifying that they maybe need something different or would like to hear something in a different way for them to be able to understand it. And giving the coach permission to step in a conversation and ask how that's going for them. Have they done it right? The biggest example for me is in the course walks between coach and athlete, and how easy it is for misunderstandings to happen within that course walk. And I think if we in the background can understand how an athlete is thinking, how an athlete is approaching that course walk, how they like to make their plans, a coach can then adapt their style slightly to meet the needs of the athlete in that moment in time, so that they leave with confidence and clarity in their plan and how they might go about trying to deliver that plan on the course. So yeah, I think a lot of it is about raising issues and topics to the surface where possible, to check and challenge whether as a coach you're translating your knowledge and your support in the most effective way to the individuals, the athletes that are receiving it. I don't know, Chris, have you got any thoughts on that? Don't know if that's the right time to bring you in.
Yeah, I was going to say, I guess there's probably good examples of that with me and Gaz, actually. Probably there's times where we've found there's been a miscommunication because originally the relationship didn't click as easily or organically as what has done with other people. And I guess it was actually the raising awareness of that then allowed both of us to then challenge it to not fit what works, but to try and mold what would then best fit the scenarios that are there.
Yeah.
And actually working quite hard within that to help build and then probably make a stronger relationship because of it.
Yeah. It is really interesting because I think it can feel like it needs to be an organic process. However, I think sometimes through working through a challenging relationship, by raising topics to the surface and making the way you want to work with each other really explicit, you end up with perhaps a more fruitful working relationship that really has a positive effect on the athlete, their growth, and their striving for their performance to improve. Yeah.
Thanks, Danielle. Chris, it seems like a natural time to just delve into your world a little bit. I think there's always two sides to the coin on the coach-athlete relationship topic. And the athlete side is not one that is often represented, actually. So firstly, thank you for coming on and willing to talk so openly. In the nicest possible way, Chris, we discussed this yesterday in prep. You've been through a lot of coaches. I don't think that's a reflection of your behaviors and your demeanor in that situation. Chris has been kind of through what some might call a natural pathway, I guess. Started with a strong club, came through the talent ranks into the senior ranks, and is now an established member of the senior team. So I guess, Chris, just keen to hear on your reflections of what, from the athlete world, what coach-athlete relationships mean to you, and perhaps how that's maybe shifted or changed, or what you've needed through your journey.
Yeah, I guess the coach-athlete relationship for me is actually probably quite an important part, because that's where I get a lot of my trust and belief within my own, not ability, but ability to and confidence to perform on a race day. And I've probably been quite fortunate in one respect to have all them different coaches throughout my career to see actually what I've preferred and what I haven't. So I've almost had experience and been exposed to so many different types of coaching that's actually allowed me to realize what I think, or given me more options to realize what maybe I prefer more than others. And from that, I guess, realizing that there's a lot to it as well. But actually, ultimately, from, as I say, some relationships that have been quite organic with some coaches I've had where I haven't really had to work with it at all. It's just felt like it's been quite natural to other relationships where I've actually probably spent quite a lot of time working to try and build that relationship to really get that confidence and belief when it comes to, say, race days or setting training plans, to be able to really believe in it. And then actually that's probably quite a significant part of the sort of ability to deliver and confidence in what you're doing on a daily basis.
Brilliant. I'll just chip in there, Chris. I want to dive a little bit deeper if I can. I think if ever there's a profound message to coaches, that is it, from the athlete voice. A sense that the relationship with the coach will inform an athlete's ability and confidence to perform. I think that gives you a sense of the responsibility, and how the author John O'Sullivan would suggest is that every moment matters. You've got to be conscious of language, of actions, of self in each of those moments. Chris, out when maybe some relationships naturally form quite organically and quite smooth. I guess we can all touch on that in our social, personal lives as well as our professional. I'm really intrigued about the ones you feel like you've had to work for a little bit more. And from an athlete perspective, what have you done? What actions have you taken to try and accelerate that growth of the relationship?
Yeah, I guess probably the most obvious one to me, and I hope you don't mind me saying, is probably with Gaz. Originally, we didn't not get on as people, but actually as a coach-athlete relationship really struggled. There was a lot of time where we probably didn't necessarily not clash, but we didn't see things in the same way. So it was harder to take that confidence and belief going into things. And actually the process that we used mostly was quite a lot with Danielle, in all honesty. And it was the ability to actually just get part of it was getting everything out on the table, as much of getting each other's values and what we stand for and how we are as people. And actually almost that gave each other, or especially for me, an understanding of what I was almost, what I'd expect would be the norm almost. And then also from that to then develop ways of how Gaz could maybe change what he would call his norm to try and fit what would suit me on certain occasions, but also doing what he would call the norm at other times as well, but fitted for the right situation, to sort of allow for that, well, A, to strengthen that relationship, but B, to almost in the high pressure situations for me to feel like I'm still getting that confidence from the key bits that I wanted to.
Fantastic. So I'm hearing there a real time taken, and it does take time. I think we'd all reflect on that to build any relationship, that sense of building an individuality, whilst also I'm hearing being authentic to self. So whilst being authentic to self, being able to adapt self to the individual, both from an athlete and coach perspective. Chris, I'm really intrigued. You've been through a lot of transitions. There'll be a lot of coaches on the line now whose key role it is to transition athletes through a pathway. I guess what's your headline, one piece of advice for coaches in receiving a new athlete in transition? What's the best sort of practice you think they could do to really strike off that relationship strong from the off?
I think it's treat each athlete as an individual. Not every athlete's the same. Mm. And the sooner you can realize that, I think the sooner you can change your behavior towards each athlete depending on how they respond to situations. Every athlete needs something different.
Fantastic. Treat every athlete individually. Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. I think you've teed up for a nice segue over to Tim here to represent the Flatwater Club side. Tim, I can hear your brain going, I want to treat every athlete individual. All sounds good. I've got innumerable amounts of athletes who I see on a much more limited basis. Tim, I guess, can you give us a sense of some of the opportunities and challenges faced in your world from a club coach perspective when talking around the coach-athlete relationship?
Well, Chris, a lot of the stuff that's been talked about already chimes, very well with the way we try and approach things at Norwich and the way I try and approach things. Certainly, trying to develop individual relationships with athletes is absolutely the key. And it just is more difficult in a club situation where you've got more athletes, you don't necessarily see them, you see some more often than others. And they've got a lot of other things. They're teenagers growing up, they've got a lot of other distractions, they've got a lot of other things going on in their life. So the key thing is to try and make time whenever you can to have some one-on-one time with athletes and try and find out what makes them tick. Try and find out what it is that you can offer them and get to the bottom of what are their needs and their wants, because they will all be individual. And while we spend a lot of time training in groups, if you've got some background of their individual needs and wants, then you can, to some extent, apply that, even if it's shorthand conversation with them, even if it's acknowledging that you know what it is that they're facing that particular day. So it's no different really on a club level, other than perhaps the parents play, I'm guessing, a larger role, in the sense that the parents have a massive input into whether the paddlers buy into what you're doing, whether you've got that relationship with the parents, if the parents trust what you're doing, or what the club is doing, what the coaches are doing, then that will make a huge difference in terms of whether the junior paddlers buy into the training. And as Danielle said, the confidence and commitment to what you're doing is absolutely key. And if the paddlers are slightly on the periphery and sort of, turning up now and again, and which is fine, we're happy to have people come along and do that. But if their ultimate goal is to excel to the best of their ability, then in that case, then you really do need a buy-in to what's going on, and a trust and a confidence.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tim. I think we heard from Danielle at the start there in terms of understanding the person in front of you there and then. And I guess you're managing the stresses from all walks of life through adolescence, in terms of, I guess, their social interactions, their school and studies, and probably how they arrive at training that day is very different for very different people at very different times. I guess the parents do play a key role. They are a key influence. Have you got any examples for the viewers, Tim, on what strategies you've used to help parent buy-in or assist parent buy-in to then facilitate coach-athlete relationships?
Well, I think that's definitely one area where I can improve and where we can develop as a club. And that's one thing we're looking at, having more formal meetings. I mean, we're very lucky at Norwich in that we have a fantastic facility, and that on a Saturday morning after the session, we have a big cafeteria area where people can get breakfast, and we can have informal chats with parents, at leisure. And it is a great opportunity. There's a couple of hours there where you can get around and have a chat with parents. But I think even that, and initially I thought that was enough, but actually I think you do need to also have formal meetings with groups of parents, and just say, look, this is what we're trying to achieve, and this is the structure which we're trying to stick to, so that I think that gives them a bit more confidence, as well as alongside the informal chats, in which case you can, again, it comes down to the individuality. You can talk about individual paddlers, etc., and get to know them a bit better.
Brilliant, thank you, Tim. I think it's really interesting when you broaden out to the stakeholders involved in any coach-athlete relationship, and you apply the research. And I'm hearing a lot about this sense of co-creation, that almost emotional engagement from others, including parents, in the process, in the buy-in. I love that blend of formal and informal. Heard that a lot this week in rugby webinars, in terms of, you know, getting around the parents on the touchline, just sense checking where their child may be at, how they've arrived today, what they're leaving with, things the parents are noticing about practice. I think that's all absolutely pivotal stuff to giving anyone who is time pressured and volume pressured in terms of coaching a number of individuals a real helping hand in terms of accelerating the relationships. And I guess allowing young people to feel safe in your environment is pivotal as a result of that. Danielle, I'm just conscious of your experience across a broad network of sports. Do you have any examples of what you've seen that's really rocking it, best practice in other sports in terms of the sort of adolescent pathway?
I've not worked at that level, if I'm honest. But I think what I would be encouraging is for a coach to start 100% with themselves, regardless of the constraints. And Tim talked about, it's not really that much difference when you've got more athletes. I really love that. Optimistic. But I can imagine that it must be quite testing to feel like you're giving a bigger group of athletes what they need. But I think the best way to do that is to start with yourself, and as a coach have real clarity on what your strengths are. Are they in writing a training program? Are they noticing behaviors? Are they in the technical delivery of the sport? Understand what your measures of success are. What will you be seeing if you're being successful in your coaching? And within those measures of success, where are your controllables? Like what really can you control? And also what your emotional drives are linked to. What do you want to achieve in your own career? So not just a measure of success in terms of what you're seeing in the athletes, but also, well, what do you want to achieve? Because if you have real clarity on those areas, you'll be really consistent, and the athletes will build trust in you as a result of you having so much confidence in those things. Then you'll know also where in your repertoire is this idea of understanding and reading the behaviors and feelings of the individuals that you're working with. Some of you out there, that will be your absolute strength. You'll be so good at reading the personalities in the group of athletes that you're working with. And for some of you, that might be a harder task, because your strength might be in the writing of the training program. And then I'd encourage you to use your strengths as you can, because you won't have to put a huge amount of time into that. You can trust that you will notice what the individuals in your training group are responding to. When do they look, feel, and see comfortable? When are they demonstrating that confidence and that clarity? And then for those coaches out there that it doesn't feel so natural, you'd want to do a little bit of what Tim says and create opportunities for your athletes to show you a little bit more about themselves explicitly, and give yourself the permission to almost ask questions that are relevant to their development age, that help guide you to be better at delivering support, fun and growth for them. Hopefully that answers your question.
Brilliant. I think it does, Danielle, absolutely. Just an encouragement at this stage for questions, guys. We've got 20 minutes left, so it's the time to bombard the panel with some questions. Not often we have an athlete on, so feel free to do that. Really engage while we're here. Danielle, that sense of self, I think, really comes through true and comes through strongly when you talk. I heard a mentor of mine, fortunate enough to work with for a couple of years, asked me 2 questions about a year ago that just made me stop in my tracks. One was why do you coach? And the other was, why do you coach the way you coach? And I've found that a really useful exercise. I was someone who tried to find my coaching philosophy for about 10 years before that and really struggled. Felt it was forced on me, felt I was trying to fulfill a coaching course unit credit or something. And it was only when asked those 2 questions that I really felt like I owned it and it was mine. And then when I reflected back, how much that had changed over the years. And the third question I've added onto it recently is, how well does that relate to the environment I currently work in? And that's a sense check, I guess, what we've heard from Chris around how we adapt to the individual. Because our lens might not be the correct lens for the person in front of us right there, right then, in terms of what you're there to co-create. Got a question coming in right on cue. Mr. Proctor, welcome. It's one for Chris. Chris, how long do you think it took yourself and Gaz to feel that sense of team? And through that experience, would you enter a new coach relationship differently based off that awareness? Thank you, Mark.
I'd say the amount of time it took, I think it still is an ever-evolving thing. It's something that will probably never stay still. It'll constantly evolve through time. I'd say it was probably a good year, though, until we felt like we both had clarity on what each other were looking for, or certainly I did. And as I say, just from there, it's probably more of just an ever-evolving process of just as we both evolve as humans and change as humans, we will slightly tweak that style, but probably definitely needs a lot less sort of, I don't want to call it maintenance, but checking in with, and is probably a bit more natural now instead of before, where we had to make more of a conscious effort to make sure that we were doing it and it was actually working. And then if I'd do anything differently, if I was to enter a new coach relationship, I don't think so, because I think the key part about it is actually it still could happen naturally. It's actually, you've got to go in being yourself, being honest and true to yourself as the athlete, from my perspective, and actually from there you can see if that coach-athlete relationship's then going to work, or whether you're actually going to need to do other things to help it flourish. From my point of view, if there's no point in going in as almost not being yourself, because in the toughest moments you're going to end up being true to yourself, and actually that's then will cause conflict in probably your most vulnerable moments instead of getting it off from the off.
That's good. That makes sense.
Brilliant, really honest reflection. Chris, I'm wondering if there was any one moment where you suddenly realized that relationship was thriving and it was more comfortable then, or whether it was just an evolution over time?
I think it was very much just an evolution over time. There's probably a few moments, mainly when followed by, for me, because I'm quite numbers and process driven, actually, when say, if it sounds, things like a training plan came to fruition and you ended up producing really good numbers at the end of that block, or come to a race and deliver well at the race, actually that almost just reinforces what you've been working on together, to then see it come together into a point. But also it is just a general evolution through time, because obviously things like that don't come not naturally, but don't come one after the next. There's going to be ups and downs to that, as much as there will be with the relationship.
Superb. He's got one more. He's coming in strong here, Proctor. What do you feel more? Do you feel more chats like this would be beneficial for athletes? I guess, yeah, we were keen to make this these webinars about really hitting a broad range of people and representing different areas of the program. I guess, do you think this would be beneficial for athletes here in this sort of forum, this sort of content, Chris?
I think it's maybe good to highlight to people that actually what some people see as that coach and athlete have a perfect relationship. For some people, actually, maybe when they look down and realize maybe they didn't, and actually that's just what you see, and actually they don't, it's almost they don't see the work that's maybe gone behind that and how that can change relationship in some respects. Like, I guess if I'd known that prior to working with guys, or done something like that prior to working with guys, maybe that would have changed my original outlook, and like having to work so hard at the start and almost seeing it as more of a straight off the off as, oh, this is a journey that every athlete goes through, which I'm sure every athlete will in some sort of respect. It's just obviously different for all athletes.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Amazing reflections. Danielle's blown away there. I'm going to come to you, Danielle, actually. I guess you said something to me last week as I was preparing to deliver a webinar on this topic myself to another sport. And you said that you saw, if I understood correctly, you saw the main role of the coach to foster a sense of connection with self in the learner. I just wonder if you're able to, that really resonated with me as such a powerful comment as to what the purpose of a coach may be from a psychologist's perspective. Are you able to expand on that? I guess what you mean by that, how we can reflect upon the success of that through things we observe in that relationship?
I think Chris pretty much said it, if I'm honest. In that, what I observed for Chris was that there was an over acceptance that he and Gaz work and look at things very differently, and that the mutual understanding or connection from a personality perspective just takes a bit more work, given how different your lenses are as people. But through working through those conversations that we had and that Gaz and you had, it wasn't that like now everything works really, really well. It was that, oh, we accept that we are two very different people, but we share some values, and we share where we want to get to, and we understand where each other want to get to. And Gaz isn't here to speak for himself, but I think he demonstrated as a coach that real wish for Chris to thrive, and wanted Chris to go on his own most natural journey, but to facilitate it. And we talk about fast track learning, don't we, Chris?
Yeah.
Raising something as soon as we can see it, to then go, right, how are we going to learn through this process with everything we know as a three, for the sake of performance on a time scale. We see if we can fast track it, so raise it to the surface. And Gaz is always very, very, very open about wanting to ensure that Chris is driving that Chris is learning through it, that Chris is reflecting, and then feeding back to Gaz and myself, particularly Gaz, what he wants from Gaz moving forward. So we create that permission for Chris to say, Gaz, I need this from you. Then you try it, and you see what works, you see what doesn't. So ultimately, Gaz has almost been the facilitator to support Chris's growth and Chris's independent in that process. I don't know if I've answered your question there, really.
Fantastic, thank you. It really does. I think that sense is coming across, that empowerment Chris is afforded in the relationship, and that sense of dialogue that offers the opportunity to feedback from the athlete, from Chris in this circumstance, to really feel. We heard last week from Imogen in terms of practice design. I think it relates here well, that her observation was that they take more pride in something they've had a choice in.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of that sense of co-creation, or Chris leading here, really comes across strong with that same mindset.
And I think through this journey where Chris and Gaz have been so committed to work on their coach-athlete relationship, through what was initially experienced as a challenge, I'd like to think that, and Chris, you might be able to answer this now or not, and if you can't, don't worry, that Chris probably feels quite equipped to work with other coaches should that happen. Oh, well, it did happen a little while ago, didn't it? When Gaz got stuck in the hospital. That as a result of Chris and Gaz working on that coach-athlete relationship with commitment, that they're both able to then take what they've learned from that process to thrive in other scenarios. I think Chris could work really well with pretty much any coach now. It might not be super smooth, because we know that it won't always be super smooth, but I think you'd be really well equipped to know, almost guide that journey. What would you say to that? No.
Yeah. No, I agree, and it's funny that Rich is actually in this as well, because actually he really wants absolutely. But actually, I thought when I ended up working with Rich when Gaz went ill in hospital, actually I felt like I almost tried to communicate to him with what worked for me and what I knew worked, because we were racing, we didn't have any time to train, and actually that was just through learnings in the past with Gaz of how I'd felt, what had evolved to work for me on a race day, and then I could just sort of quickly use that and just almost take another coach, because that was the opportunity I was given at that time to just deliver that. And then actually Rich worked well around that, and I thought that sort of, it was probably, I wouldn't have had a clue to do anything like that if it wasn't for previous learnings of having to explore and develop about what actually works for me, the athlete.
Nice.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. I remember that very occasion. I had been running with him the night before. I don't think we spiked any of his food that evening, but and Richie, quite right, did a superb job, as did you, in really driving your processes. I think that's probably another session at some point, in terms of how we as coaches can shape an environment that allows us to learn more about others through practice design. How can you shape your sessions so you elicit further understanding of an individual, particularly prevalent for group sessions, that good use of time. I think that could well be another session. If Danielle could note that down for us, that'd be superb. But also, as Chris has put down there, how you play with simulation in the environment, perhaps easier as you go up the pathway, as you learn more and more about people, that can give them a sense check of their self. Little things like leaving the first 10 minutes of your session open to free play. What do you see? Tells you a lot about the people in front of you. What do they enjoy doing when you're not instructing, if you are someone who instructs? And the no-show, as it's known there, which on this occasion with Gaz, with Chris, wasn't an intentional no-show, but how do you adapt? How does the athlete then step into that sort of leadership role that you would hope to be creating with them, and gives you a sense check of where they're at in their development at that time, and maybe feedback in itself to the way your environment is being effective at that point. Got another cracking question coming in from Mr. Goddard. Thank you, Dan. I'm going to throw this to Danielle and Tim. Do we think it's beneficial to have many coaches over the years, or would it be better developing a deeper connection with a single coach, knowing that it takes time?
Tim, have you got any thoughts? I don't want to jump in.
Okay. I think there are examples of both scenarios that have worked out. You can look across different sports where very successful athletes have had a single coach. I think in the world we're in certainly as far as our club is concerned, inevitably there is a pathway, and giving the athletes and the paddlers the tools, if you like, to be able to work with different coaches is really important. And also as they grow up, going on training days, they'll be exposed to different methods of coaching, which is really, really healthy. Because I think someone mentioned earlier on, there's the classic thing where you may express something to a junior paddler about their technique, for example, and you might express this over a number of years, and they'll go away for one day and they'll say, "Oh, so and so told me this," and because it's coming from someone new, they will take it on board, and you'll think, well, you know, so that's what I've been
How
saying
many years
for 2
have you been trying to get that message across?
Ivan Lawler once said to me, he said, athletes, particularly junior athletes, probably listen to the coaches that they see least the most. So if they see you every day, they don't really pay that much attention to you. Whereas if they go away to a training day, their senses are heightened and it's a special occasion, and they'll take things on board much more readily. So from all those points of view, it is very healthy to be exposed to different coaches, different coaching techniques.
Yeah, I think, well said. And something that I think Mark Proctor will hopefully recognise is we've been talking in the background around how in the program can we help athletes grow to a place where they can work with any coach. Should that be because their coach is unwell, like in Chris's scenario, or because there's a coach with some really, really impactful information to give, or there's a future with that coach potentially later down the road. But yeah, I think the exposure to the differing coaches is really, really powerful for a young athlete to experience.
Brilliant. Thank you, Danielle. I've got one more question coming in, but via WhatsApp, actually. So excuse me for putting the head down slightly. It's to Chris. I guess, well, it's around Chris's sort of knowledge and experience. So I guess you talked about what you want from a coach, Chris. I guess from a coaching perspective, are we there to facilitate athletes, Chris, from your opinion? Or do we create a place where the athlete is open-minded and wants that challenge? I guess so. Are we there to do what you want, Chris? Or are we there to challenge you? Where's the balance?
I think both are important. I think it's as an athlete, I'd probably see it as more from my perspective anyway. It's a bit of a depends where you are in your development a bit, and B, time of the year and stuff. I think challenge is healthy, and that's something that I like in a coach, to be able to challenge me, to tell me no, to tell me things like that, and almost to say, and do even to the idea of bringing new ideas to the table as well. But also, I think that as for me as an athlete anyway, there becomes a time of actually not necessarily challenge, it's more confirming, gaining confidence from that confirmation at certain areas of time. But without the challenge beforehand, you can't have taken the learning to know where that comes from you as the athlete.
Fantastic. Well answered. So that's a license, I think, but use it wisely and responsibly. Everybody, I'm just reminded there of a few things, Chris. I think to kind of bring this to a close, I think the knowledge of yourself as a coach and the knowledge of the person in front of you gives you an ability to calibrate to the science. And what I mean by that is sense checking who's in front of you at that very moment, and whether they're thriving, whether they're surviving, whether they're sometimes somewhere in between, and where that is in the bigger picture of what's important now, as Chris put it, relative perhaps to competition, is that how that balance or that dial of challenge and support is tweaked is a real key responsibility and a big skill of the coach, I think. I listened to a brilliant podcast, which I'll give a shout out to now, from Dave Allred, who's worked with Johnny Wilkinson, Johnny Sexton on BBC Sounds last week. He talked about, particularly when picking up a new athlete, that sense of not rushing in, being really clear to observe things you think they're doing really well, and then looking to introduce things that they could do differently. Not do better, do differently. And he was really clear on that. And I think it's that sense of building rapport, building trust, cooperation, as Sophia would call it, and co-commitment, before you then bring and dial that challenge up. And the most important thing that Danielle touched on really clearly is ask. I guess be willing and open-minded and vulnerable to feedback when you do challenge and when you do support, to hear back and get feedback on that and adapt accordingly, I guess, to the feedback and reflections you hear. Brilliant. Well, we're coming to a minute to go. I think we've covered all the questions. Thank you so much for everyone's engagement. A massive thank you to the panel, to Danielle, to Tim, to Chris for taking the time out. You're not all employed at all full-time by Canoeing. So thank you very much. We really appreciate your time, and your input has been absolutely invaluable. As ever, guys, this has been recorded. It'll be uploaded in the next couple of days to the British Canoeing website under the digital library section. Thanks to Andy for some of the links. Danielle will contribute to that. If you could send those over, Danielle, afterwards for the Jowett stuff, that would be amazing. And we'll put those in there. And I'll try and send a link to the Dave Allred podcast as well. Looking forward to next week. We're touching on athlete motivation, I guess, with a particular context to this environment, hoping to have coaches across the pathway and a psychologist on for that one. A sense check of where we're at, looking at individuality within that, but also what a return to training may look like with an uncertain future, and how as coaches and practitioners we can play a role in that. Thank you very, very much. Please stay safe, 4th week of lockdown, and we look forward to seeing you very, very soon. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.